The conventional history we all learned in school tells us that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, and that the first black people to arrive in the Americas were enslaved Africans brought by Portuguese and Spanish traders during the transatlantic slave trade, starting in the early 16th century. For generations, this has been the accepted narrative, taught in classrooms across the world and repeated so often that it became unquestionable fact. But recent research has been challenging that story in fundamental ways. Evidence has been mounting, quietly and persistently, that some black people had been living in the Americas for more than 1,000 years before Columbus ever stepped foot on the continent. In fact, there is now substantial documentation pointing to the possibility that Africans sailed to and settled in the Americas long before European colonization, contributing to early American civilizations in ways that have been systematically ignored or dismissed by mainstream history. One of the first serious scholars to investigate this possibility was Leo Wiener, a Russian-born linguist who immigrated to the United States in the late 19th century and eventually became a professor at Harvard University. While traveling through Mesoamerica in the early 1900s, Wiener began noticing linguistic and botanical similarities between African and American cultures that seemed too specific and too numerous to be coincidental. Between 1920 and 1922, he published a massive 3-volume work called Africa and the Discovery of America, in which he argued that Africans had reached the Americas centuries before Columbus and had influenced indigenous cultures in measurable ways. At the time Wiener was writing, archaeological methods were still developing, and he did not have access to the kind of physical evidence that would support his theories in ways the scientific community could not ignore. But he knew other clues existed. For instance, he pointed out that Columbus himself was aware that African mariners had preceded him. In Columbus's diary from his second voyage, he recorded that the natives of Hispaniola gave him gold-tipped metal spearheads, and these natives told him explicitly that black-skinned people had come in large boats from the south and southeast, bringing these spears with them. Columbus was curious enough about this claim that when he returned to Spain, he had the spearheads analyzed. The metallurgists found that they were made of an alloy called guanin, consisting of 18 parts gold, 6 parts silver, and 8 parts copper. This exact ratio matched the metal traditionally used in West African spearheads for thousands of years, particularly those carried by medieval warriors from Mali and Moorish territories. The West Africans even called this metal guanin, the same name used by the natives of Hispaniola. That information, recorded by Columbus himself in his own journals, should have sparked serious investigation into African presence in the Americas before 1492, but it was quietly ignored, likely because Spain's political and economic interests depended on maintaining the narrative that Columbus had discovered virgin territory, not land already visited and inhabited by others. Acknowledging prior African contact would have complicated Spain's territorial claims in the West Indies. Wiener also noticed something else that bothered him as a linguist. Many of the place names and plant names used by indigenous people in Mesoamerica sounded distinctly like words from Bantu and Arabic, the languages spoken across large parts of West and North Africa. He was not the only one puzzled by this. Botanists had long struggled to explain how certain plants native to Africa appeared in the Americas before Columbus, and how certain American plants appeared in Africa before any documented transatlantic contact. The bottle gourd, for instance, originated in West Africa and was cultivated in the Americas long before Europeans arrived, and it also reached the Americas before it spread to Indonesia or Polynesia, meaning the Pacific was the last place it appeared, not the first. Similarly, crops like the yam, sweet potato, domesticated cotton, peanuts, and tobacco were found on both sides of the Atlantic in ways that suggested active trade rather than independent domestication. So how did these plants cross the ocean? The most logical explanation, one that historians resisted for decades, is that Africans were sailing back and forth across the Atlantic long before European explorers claimed to have opened those routes. And here is the part that surprises people. Africans were extraordinarily skilled shipbuilders. They had been building seaworthy vessels for thousands of years. Ancient Nubian pottery from 3000 BCE shows images of large boats with multiple oars. Egyptian reliefs depict complex riverboats designed for long-distance travel. By the 15th century, West African societies were constructing dugout canoes large enough to hold 80 men, and they were lashing 2 dugouts together to create stable catamarans capable of handling open ocean conditions. In 1500, just a few years after Columbus's voyage, Portuguese captain Pacheco Pereira, wrote that he had seen canoes on the African coast, so large they could transport 80 people and substantial cargo. To demonstrate that it was physically possible for ancient Africans to cross the Atlantic using the technology available to them, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl built 2 papyrus vessels, Ra 1 and Ra 2, using ancient shipbuilding techniques documented from Egyptian and Nubian sources. In 1969 and 1970, he successfully sailed these vessels across the Atlantic, proving that even without modern navigation tools, a papyrus raft could complete the journey by riding ocean currents. In favorable conditions, ancient African vessels could have averaged 60 to 100 miles per day, meaning a transatlantic crossing, while difficult, was entirely achievable. There is also historical documentation of these voyages. Islamic historian Al-Umari reported that in 1311, the Mali Emperor Mansur Abu Bakr II commissioned an expedition with 200 ships filled with men and another 200 ships carrying gold, water, and provisions for 2 years. The emperor instructed the fleet to sail west across the Atlantic and find what lay beyond, and if they did not return, it meant they had either discovered something or run out of supplies. Only 1 ship returned. The captain reported that the fleet had sailed for a long time until they encountered what seemed like a river with a powerful current flowing in the open sea. He turned back, but the other ships continued and disappeared. This account, recorded over 150 years before Columbus, describes what could very well have been the encounter with the Gulf Stream, or the powerful equatorial currents that flow from West Africa toward the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. One of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting African presence in the Americas before Columbus comes, ironically, from Columbus himself. According to historian and linguist Leo Wiener, Columbus noted in his journal that Native Americans confirmed black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading gold-tipped spears. The metal composition of those spears, as mentioned earlier, matched African metallurgy exactly. This is not speculation or reinterpretation. This is Columbus's own written testimony, recorded during his second voyage, describing what the indigenous people told him about visitors who had arrived before him. Columbus was not the only European explorer to report seeing evidence of an African presence. Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, also reported encountering dark-skinned people in the region. These accounts from multiple independent sources suggest that there were people of African descent living in the Caribbean and Central America long before the transatlantic slave trade began. Perhaps the most visually striking evidence of ancient African presence in the Americas comes from the Olmec civilization, which existed in what is now southern Mexico from roughly 1200 BCE to 400 BCE. The Olmecs are considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the first significant civilization in the region, and they are best known for the colossal stone heads they carved, some weighing up to 40 tons and standing over 11 feet tall. When the first of these heads was discovered in 1862 by explorer José Melgar, he was struck by what he described as their Ethiopian features: broad noses, full lips, and a physical appearance that seemed distinctly African rather than indigenous American. Over the years, 17 of these massive heads have been found, and the debate over their appearance has never fully subsided. Those who believe the Olmecs had African connections point to several factors. The heads appear to depict specific individuals, possibly rulers or important figures, and their facial features, particularly when viewed alongside the people living in the region today, seem to some observers to suggest African ancestry. Additionally, the Olmec civilization was responsible for introducing written language, sophisticated astronomy, advanced mathematics, and complex social structures to Mesoamerica, all of which later influenced the Maya and Aztec civilizations. Some researchers, including historian Ivan van Sertima, in his controversial 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, have argued that these achievements reflect African influence, possibly from Egyptian or West African visitors who brought knowledge of writing systems, pyramid construction, and calendar technology. However, it is crucial to note that mainstream archaeologists and Mesoamerican scholars overwhelmingly reject the theory that the Olmecs were of African origin or significantly influenced by African visitors. In 2020, researchers at Mexico's National Autonomous University conducted mitochondrial DNA analysis on remains found at Olmec archaeological sites in Veracruz, and the results showed that the individuals belonged to haplogroup A, one of the founding lineages of indigenous American populations. If the Olmecs had been African or had significant African ancestry, they would have carried haplogroup L, which is characteristic of African populations. That marker was not present. Furthermore, no African artifacts have ever been found in controlled archaeological excavations at Olmec sites. The consensus among experts is that the Olmec heads depict indigenous Mesoamerican people, and their features, which some interpret as African, actually match the physical characteristics of people still living in that region of Mexico today. Anthropologist Anne Cyphers, who discovered one of the Olmec heads in 1994, explained that the theory of African origins dates back to 1069, when the Olmec culture itself was not yet known to exist. José Melgar proposed that the sculptures represented Ethiopians based purely on subjective interpretation of facial features. That speculation, she noted, has haunted Olmec archaeology for over 150 years despite lacking any supporting evidence. Michael Coe, a leading Mesoamerican historian who spent years excavating Olmec sites, stated unequivocally that there is nothing at these sites that looks African, Chinese, European, or Near Eastern, and that the Olmec culture was created and maintained entirely by indigenous American peoples with a Mesoamerican way of life centered on maize cultivation. So where does that leave us? The Olmec heads, while visually striking and open to interpretation, do not provide conclusive evidence of African presence. But that does not mean all evidence should be dismissed. There are other indicators that deserve serious consideration. For instance, archaeologists have discovered the presence of cocaine and nicotine in ancient Egyptian mummies, substances that could only have come from plants native to the Americas. South American cocaine from the coca plant and nicotine from tobacco. German toxicologist Svetla Balabanova reported these findings, which stunned many historians because they suggest transatlantic trade long before Columbus. How else would these distinctly American compounds have reached ancient Egypt unless there was contact between the two continents? There are also similarities in religious iconography and ritual practices. The Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas all worship deities depicted with dark skin and features that some researchers have described as distinctly African. Ancient cave paintings in Juxtlahuaca in southwestern Mexico show scenes that closely resemble Egyptian religious rituals, including the famous opening of the mouth ceremony. These similarities occur too frequently and across too many unrelated sites to be easily dismissed as coincidence. Then there are the pyramids. Egypt is famous for its pyramids, but the Americas actually contain more pyramid structures than any other region in the world. The key difference, as noted by scholars like Professor Everett Borders, is that Egyptian pyramids show clear developmental progression. You can see the evolution from the early stepped pyramid of Djoser to the more refined and sophisticated structures at Giza. But the pyramids in Central America, particularly those built by the Olmecs, do not show that same progression. They appear fully formed, as if the builders already knew how to construct them. This has led some to theorize that pyramid building knowledge came to the Americas from people who had already mastered the technique elsewhere, namely in Egypt or West Africa. There is also skeletal evidence, though it is limited and contested. In 1975, the New York Times reported that a Smithsonian Institution team had found 2 male skeletons in the U.S. Virgin Islands, whose physical characteristics suggested African descent, and the soil layers in which they were buried were dated to around 1250 CE. Polish researcher Anders Wyszynski claimed to have found African-type skulls at ancient Mesoamerican sites, though his findings have not been widely replicated or accepted by the broader archaeological community. Taking all of this together, what can we reasonably conclude? First, we know for certain that Africans were capable of crossing the Atlantic. They had the ships, the navigational knowledge, and the maritime traditions stretching back thousands of years. Second, we know that Columbus himself recorded indigenous testimony about black-skinned visitors arriving before him, and the metal artifacts described in his journals match African metallurgy. Third, we know that plants and possibly even chemical compounds crossed the Atlantic in both directions before documented European contact, which strongly suggests some form of exchange. Fourth, we know that there are linguistic, cultural, and architectural similarities between African and early American societies that are difficult to explain without some degree of contact. What we do not have is definitive, incontrovertible proof that would satisfy the strictest standards of mainstream archaeology. No undisputed African artifacts have been found in controlled excavations. No DNA evidence has been universally accepted as demonstrating African ancestry in pre-Columbian American populations. The Olmec heads, while visually suggestive to some, have been explained by researchers as depicting indigenous people whose features naturally vary within the population, and genetic testing supports that conclusion. So why does this matter? Because the history we tell shapes how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. For African Americans, the dominant narrative has always been that their ancestors arrived in chains, that their history in the Americas begins with slavery and subjugation. To discover that Africans may have come to the Americas not as slaves, but as explorers, traders, and possibly even teachers who influenced early civilizations, fundamentally changes that story. It challenges the idea that Africans were passive victims of history and reframes them as active participants in shaping the ancient world. At the same time, it is essential to be honest about what the evidence supports and what it does not. Claiming that the Olmecs were African, or that African visitors built American pyramids without solid evidence, risks undermining the real achievements of indigenous American peoples who developed these civilizations through their own ingenuity and effort. As Michael Coe and other scholars have pointed out, attempting to take credit for Mesoamerican achievements away from the people who actually created them, based on flimsy or speculative evidence, is its own form of disrespect. The most responsible position, given the current state of evidence, is to acknowledge that there are intriguing clues suggesting possible pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas, that these clues deserve continued investigation, and that dismissing them entirely because they challenge established narratives would be intellectually dishonest. At the same time, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far, the evidence, while suggestive, has not reached the threshold that would compel mainstream archaeology to revise its understanding of pre-Columbian history. What we can say with confidence is this: Africans were master shipbuilders and navigators. They had the capability to cross the Atlantic. Columbus himself recorded testimony from indigenous people about black-skinned visitors who arrived before him. Plants and possibly other materials crossed the ocean before documented European contact, and the history we have been taught about the discovery of the Americas is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Whether Africans established long-term settlements, influenced major civilizations, or simply made occasional visits that left traces in oral tradition and material culture is still being debated. But what is no longer debatable is that the story of the Americas before Columbus is far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more African than most textbooks have ever acknowledged. And that alone is worth recognizing.